Women, they are beautiful. They are surrounded by a halo of mystery. She is the object of a man's desires and the object of his love. A man does everything to make a woman choose him. Poems are written for them. In her presence, men's minds turn off and their wills become paralyzed. And when she leaves a man, he feels miserable, and he also usually feels an emptiness in his purse. There is so much confusion and emotion surrounding the relationship between the sexes that it's hard to know what's what. There are no books that say everything about relationships. There are either complicated, confusing, and unconvincing theories by psychologists, or rapturous cries of poets, or angry, aggressive demagoguery by feminists, or illogical in their bitterness writings by misogynists, but nothing even remotely intelligible. There are only a few pieces of qualitative information from biologists accustomed to studying the behavior of living beings, but even these do not provide a coherent, clear picture. Books on store shelves, written by women for women in women's language such as How to Be a Bitch or How to Fool a Man, as well as instructions on seduction and sex techniques do not count. A woman is still unknown to men, almost a supernatural object. It is true that there are individual men who know women and even know how to control them. But unfortunately, such men, as a rule, do not write books, but quietly use their knowledge. But in fact, the situation is even more absurd. Think about the following. All problems in our life are divided into solvable and unsolvable. For example, if our car, computer, or toilet cistern breaks down, this problem is solvable, because there are specialists who have the necessary knowledge and skills to solve it. Similarly, if we want to grow a garden, a vegetable garden, an apiary, or a flock of sheep, we are guaranteed to be able to do it, as there is the appropriate literature and experts. That is, we can easily control other species. But if we want to start a family, organize an effective society, or establish demography in our state, here we are surprised to find that we have no control over the situation and act practically blindly, at random. Since there is no intelligible literature and no specialists, despite abundant funding for the so-called humanities, we are surprised to discover that we are not in control of the situation. And those people who pretend to be specialists are, as a rule, unable to control their own personal lives. That is, while we can control other species of animals, we cannot even control the females of our own species. But we will try to get to the bottom of the subject of relationships. This series of videos describes and explains the nature of women, peculiarities of their behavior, the nature of female logic, female mystique, describes the principles of relations with a man, children, and society in an understandable and logical language. I will explain to you the behavior of women, and their behavior will become more understandable to you. Those who are interested in the internal logic of building and functioning of human societies and civilizations will also find answers to so many questions here. Women's society carefully withholds information from men. Therefore, it is highly discouraged to discuss the contents of this book with women. They will understand that you are too clever and therefore dangerous. So they will be very aggressive and will turn their men against you. They will also form a negative public opinion of you. Welcome to the real world. To begin with, let's get to the bottom of this question. What is the relationship between a man and a woman? Why does a man with his logical mindset most often fail to understand a woman? There are several reasons. Among them, for example, sexual attraction as a natural mechanism of shutting down the adequacy of the perception of the partner. Among them is the purposeful education of a man in illusory romantic ideas about relationships. But chief among the causes is the real entanglement of the relationship and its composite nature. Man and woman interact with each other in 3 dimensions at once, as a male and female of the Homo sapiens species, a biological relationship, as a partner and partner in business, an economic relationship, as a person and an individual, interpersonal relationships. And each of these components not only contributes to the resultant, but also influences the other components. If you look at the resultant relationship at once, it is impossible to understand anything, because everything is so jumbled and confused. So let's look at each of the components separately. This will make our task much easier. Relationships of personalities. This component makes only a small contribution to relationships, with the possible exception of a very narrow stratum of society. We will not touch this component here at all. You can read about it in a psychology textbook in your spare time. And what is erroneously attributed to interpersonal interaction is usually in fact a manifestation of either the hierarchical or the sexual instincts of the biological individual. Let's take a closer look at the main and most interesting, in our opinion, components. The relationship between the male and the female. The relationship of partners. However, it is absolutely impossible to describe a woman and a man, which are constituent parts of mankind, and their relationships without basic knowledge of mankind as a whole. So we begin our narrative with the basics, the nature of our species. Have patience, evolution of the species, and innate programs of behavior. To begin with, let's look at the male-female relationship as male and female of our species. Let's take a look at what people in society are actually like from a biological point of view, at what laws of nature they live by. Let's look back a few million years. The Lower Paleolithic. In those distant times, when our species was just beginning to form, the brains of our distant ancestors, the hominids, had instincts, innate programs of behavior. Specific features of all human species are uprightness and large brain size. In other words, since the forelimbs were designed for special purposes, the production and use of tools and weapons, humans could no longer use them fully for movement. Therefore, he was inferior in speed and agility to other animals. To compensate for this disadvantage and to survive, humans had to have some advantage in something else. This advantage was the large human brain. It allowed humans to have many more behavioral options. For example, to use a greater number of hunting and defensive techniques, to memorize them and teach them to his fellow tribesmen, to quickly assimilate, use and transmit information, and also to make and use the simplest tools and weapons. However, it is necessary to pay for everything. And the large size of the brain resulted in an extremely long period of intrauterine, as well as subsequent development and training of the offspring. In addition, due to the enlargement of the infant's head, the human female's pelvis became wider, which made her even less agile and faster. The lengthening of the period of offspring development and training made the female largely and for a long time tied to her cubs. Consequently, she was actually helpless and incapable of independent existence in the presence of a large number of large predators and other dangers of wildlife. Thus, significant anatomical differences between the male and the female of the sentient species were formed. This, in turn, inevitably led to a rather narrow specialization of the male and the female, a clear separation of their role functions in the herd. The female turned out to be oriented towards nursing and preserving her offspring. The male was focused on supplying and guarding them,